Oppenheimer. Well, that was an experience. So I'm seeing out there in the world that this movie is getting wide praise, as it should, for its incredible cast, for its incredible story, for its incredible ambition. And there are some detractors out there who are saying they were slightly underwhelmed, it was too long, too talky, kind of boring. And everyone's entitled to their own opinion. That's why we have art. That's why we have filmmaking. That's why we have movies. For me personally, this film was an absolute masterclass in filmmaking, a masterpiece. I can't wait to rewatch this again, and it's one of those movies I think that when you rewatch time after time, you will pick up on things, pick up on details that are purposely there. It's a multi-layered film, and it's not just your standard biopic. It's a biopic that's told in a Christopher Nolan type of way, which I appreciate as its original.
We imagine a future, and our imaginings horrify us.
This film reminds me of old Hollywood movies, especially biopics or grand epics in the vein of Lawrence of Arabia, in the vein of Gandhi, those types of movies. These films that are grand in scale, but they are surrounding a central character that is essentially the driving force of the plot. This film was movie magic.
We have a 12-month head start.
18.
How could you possibly know that?
Oppenheimer reminds me of the days of cinema where movies weren't afraid to be long, weren't afraid to be talky, weren't afraid to be complex, especially when it came to biopics. So I really appreciate Christopher Nolan's ambition and love for cinema. These types of movies aren't afraid to test their audience's intellectual ability. They aren't afraid to command us to pay attention. They aren't afraid to have us question and to think about things long after. I thought about this movie hours, if not days after seeing it, wondering about certain scenes, wondering about certain moments, wondering why certain moments had certain emotional effects on me, and that is cinema. And I think Christopher Nolan is one of the few directors still working today, if not the only director working today. There are others, and I'm sure there's up-and-coming ones, that are able to tap into that Spielbergian movie magic.
Our work here will ensure a peace mankind has never seen.
Until somebody builds a bigger one.
Everything in this movie is masterful, from the incredible cast. Cillian Murphy is just out of this world. He just draws your attention to him, the way his eyes gaze, the way he captured J. Robert Oppenheimer's mannerisms, the way he captured his guilt, his moral issues, who he was as a flawed human being, and it really is the driving central part of this movie. And the cast goes on and on and on, from small side roles, from Kenneth Branagh to Gary Oldman to Rami Malek to bigger roles like Robert Downey Jr. You could just tell that these actors wanted to work in a Christopher Nolan movie and that they were giving him everything they had for their craft and for his story. I forget his name, but this is kind of a random call out. His brother Frank was played by the boyfriend from the Halloween, David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy. And this is the brilliance of Christopher Nolan. He did a wonderful job, this actor, but Christopher Nolan can see actors in all these movies and he sees something in them and pulls them in, and I think that creates more of a career opportunity for people that may not have been given an opportunity or have been typecasted in certain roles. So as I said, the acting is just phenomenal across the board. And just a shout out to Robert Downey Jr., who I give immense credit for. This guy is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He made his world, his fame, more or less, with the Marvel movies. Obviously, I think he has way more skill that presented in his filmography than that. But I give him respect for wanting to come out of, I don't say retirement, I don't think he was retired, but to actually say, you know what, I don't have to do this. I have hundreds of millions of dollars. I did Marvel, I'm tired. But he put his all into this movie, and that's a working actor. That's somebody who cares, and it's also a testament to Christopher Nolan that these actors want to do that for him. One of the interesting things I found about this movie was, yes, you have all these driving forces in the plot. Now, there are three basic storylines in this. You have the Manhattan Project storyline, you have the black and white political thriller storyline, and then you have Oppenheimer's youth and story that takes place kind of after the bomb. So there's kind of three parallel storylines taking place, and in Christopher Nolan fashion, they are intertwining, weaving themselves within each other, pulling knots within each other, looping back together at certain points. And I really appreciate that when it comes to a biopic, because you've never really seen that before, even if it still has an old Hollywood feel. It's not just a standard, okay, we'll start when he's young, we'll move forward, here's a date, okay, we are now at his death, and there's the end of the movie. Lawrence of Arabia was kind of like that, but it was also different in the sense we opened up with his death in that movie, and it kind of intertwined a little bit. It was a more linear film. This is not linear. But for me, it works. I know it's not for everybody, but I appreciate that original aspect to a biopic. This movie is extremely heavy with dialogue. It's almost a 3-hour runtime. And if you put those two things together, you're automatically going to think, man, this is a snooze fest. And I know some people are saying that out there, but I found the pace to be exhilarating. And I think that has a lot to do with Ludwig Göransson's score, which is just, high octane, but classical at times. And it just keeps the shots going. I mean, his score and Christopher Nolan's shots, and obviously the editing on top of it by Jennifer Lame is just a full encompassing, trifecta that just comes together. Well, not really a trifecta, because you have Hoyte's cinematography, you have Christopher Nolan's directing, and yes, the cinematographer really is just translating the director's vision, especially with such a visual director like Christopher Nolan. But, the cinematographer and director, especially in Christopher Nolan movies, kind of come together as one. So there is technically a trifecta between the editing, composing, and visual aesthetic, and they just kind of converge and just drive this movie forward, and it's just such an incredible experience. And you hear the music. It's almost a character in itself. The cinematography, like I said, is grand in scale. Now, I don't know if you necessarily need to see this movie on IMAX. I did. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a 70 millimeter true IMAX projection. I wasn't going into New York City, even though I live an hour and a half from there. I'm done with those days. So I actually just went and saw this on a general IMAX screen, which I think is a scam because it's never true IMAX. True IMAX screens are like 3 stories tall. They curve around you, and you just know you're sitting in an IMAX theater. But it was an incredible experience nonetheless. Obviously this film was made for theaters, as the surround sound and the way the sound design hits you at certain moments was really effective. But I can totally see myself rewatching this movie on the small screen over and over again, just because it's that much of a captivating story. So definitely see this on the biggest screen you can. But I don't necessarily know if it was, oh my God, you have to see this moment in IMAX. It was just, I was so encompassed in the story and the theatrical experience that none of that really mattered to me in the end, whether I had a 70 millimeter projection or if I was in a IMAX digital projection. I know that sounds sacrilegious when it comes to cinema, and I'm a film buff. I love the film aesthetic. I love the way film looks. But again, I think the story, in my opinion, surpasses any of the technical aspects of it, and that's what's going to pull you in, especially with the performances we got here. One thing I found incredibly interesting in this movie, and one thing I walked away from thinking about greatly, is the fact that you have this genius, and the story is about this genius. And this genius, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and a lot of physics geniuses, and a lot of geniuses in general, just view the world differently. Physicists, especially on his level, can see things, and the way they capture that through, the visuals of the atoms and the stars was just beautiful. But that was the translation of how they see the world. They can look at water, they can look at things, and they can just see certain mechanics and things that we can't see, or average people can see, or people with other talents who aren't in physics. Same with Einstein, who has great cameos in this movie. Same for Heller. All these people see the world differently, but especially Robert Oppenheimer, who wasn't necessarily a mathematician, he was, but essentially that wasn't his strong point. Lab work wasn't his strong point. He was almost an artist, and he was an artist who has to paint. Anybody who's an artist knows that their outlet is what gives them peace, what gives them strength, which gives them therapy. Painters have to paint. Filmmakers need to make movies. Illustrators need to illustrate. Authors need to write. It is their outlet. Oppenheimer in the sciences, I also consider him an artist who had an unbelievable talent that he needed to work out. And I think, unfortunately, he was given an opportunity that he couldn't turn down, where he could explore those talents in New Mexico, where he loved. It was a dream for him. So nothing was going to stop him from doing this type of work, even if moral issues arose during this. So it is an unfortunate story, and I think what was interesting to me was all you have is this genius, this artist that wanted to do this work, and the whole world, he was above the fray and all that. You know, he was in his own world looking at puddles and the stars and just all this magic working in his head. But unfortunately, the world pulled him down to them instead of him pulling the world up to him. And unfortunately, his talents were used in a horrific situation, whether you agree with it or not, whether you disagree with it or not, whether it was right, whether it was wrong. And I think the film captures that beautifully. But regardless, he suffered immensely from that decision to take on this job or to create this weapon of mass destruction. And it's so interesting because the movie itself, I would say, is politically ambiguous. It doesn't show how it affected the Japanese. It doesn't show the bomb dropping in Japan. It really doesn't show a lot of the things people are talking about or some of the people are complaining about, and that's because it's really about J. Robert Oppenheimer. And it totally captures his guilt. It totally captures his moral dilemma, especially towards the end, especially after he sees the bomb exploded, which was a fantastic scene. Not necessarily the bomb, but his reaction, which was maybe 4 seconds of, and the way he took a breath in, and that changed his complete complexion as a scientist and as a person going forward. And speaking on the bomb scene, I know a lot of people are saying they were underwhelmed. It wasn't as big as it should have been. I thought it was fine, and I thought that was purposeful because a lot of the hype isn't, necessarily Christopher Nolan saying the bomb, he's doing interviews, they have to market it, I get that. But had the bomb scene been so over the top, that's what all people would have been talking about, kind of, or more or less, I think. So the biggest thing in this movie is Robert Oppenheimer's story, and everything kind of needed to stay here or else it would have overtaken that. And I think that dance, that balance, was perfectly executed. This did not feel like a 3-hour movie. As I said before, it felt like more of a 2-hour movie, and that's a testament to, as I said, the editing, the score, the pacing.
And how many people were in these open discussions?
Too many. Compartmentalization was supposed to be the protocol.
We were in a race against the Nazis.
Certain shots that Christopher Nolan captures through his cinematographer, they evoke something inside of me personally, and I'm sure it does for a lot of cinema goers and people who are fans of his work and people who have seen this movie. And those shots tied with the score, there's a moment where I think it's Kitty and Oppenheimer are coming in on a horse, or it was earlier in the film where Oppenheimer, his brother, and Josh Hartnett's character are on the horse, but you have this pounding score, and it's just a simple scene, but he's able to elevate these simple scenes into something emotional that can be tied into the spectrum of motifs and vibes the film as a whole gives off. Everything feels part of the same story, even though certain moments are completely different. And that's another testament to how tied and how glued and how cohesive and put together this film is. There's certain shots he captures, and I had mentioned this earlier, that evoke emotion. And I have to watch this movie again to find the ones that did it for me. There's certain ones that stand out, whether it's Oppenheimer on top of the tower with the bomb and his kind of silhouette looking at it, the whole sequence in the auditorium when he's struggling with the flashes and the people cheering and then kind of visualizing them crying, the ash body on the floor, incredible sequence rather than, necessarily one shot. The sweeping shots of New Mexico, the way it ends, the whole ending sequence when it ties together him and his conversation with Einstein and how they talk about the world and who they are and what they kicked off, and that the way the score hits and you have the earth, it's just a beautiful, haunting ending. But there's certain things that Christopher Nolan is able to tap into with his cinematography, which I think a lot of movies nowadays don't. And one example, not so much from Oppenheimer, but in Interstellar, when Cooper detaches and he says goodbye to Brand, the way the score kind of carries those shots along, and the way that Brand is looking at Coop through both shuttles, and it felt like old Hollywood.
Cooper, what are you doing?
Newton's third law. You gotta leave something behind.
You told me we had enough resources for both of us.
We agreed, Amelia. 90%. Detach.
I don't know if it's so much the film aesthetic that he's using. I don't know so much if it's just the score or if it's just the way the dialogue works. But I think, as I had said earlier, it's the convergence of all those things working together. And I think that's how you tap into movie magic, like Spielberg did movie after movie after movie back in the day. You know, it's a hard thing to find nowadays, but it does exist. It goes beyond film. It goes beyond, you know, the mechanics of making a movie. It's something that's achieved through hard work, cohesiveness, and a little bit of luck by getting all the pieces together. But if you have a director at the helm who wants to pay attention to every little detail as much as he pays attention to every macro detail, but also not be a control freak and let his tools go out and operate as they should, let actors act, don't control them, let editors edit, but also oversee it and make sure it's your vision. If you let that happen, if you give all these pieces their space to play and do what they're good at doing, and you can kind of tie it together and formulate that initial vision you had when you wrote that original script, the chances of creating those magical moments are infinite.
It's about unleashing the strong force before the Nazis do.
Oh my God.
I will always say filmmaking is the ultimate art form. It combines lighting, science, writing, performance, fashion. It goes on and on and on. Sound, music, audio, it's everything combined into one. And when that comes together fully, then I think you have movie magic. And in this movie, it is untapped glory, in my personal opinion. So I notice a lot of people out there will say Christopher Nolan's movies don't have heart and that they're rather cold and he needs more heart. I tend to disagree. I do agree that a lot of his films do have a cold aura about them, but I think there's moments in those films where heart spikes in and spikes out, especially towards the end. I'll give you an example. Tenet. Not my favorite movie. I appreciate the ambition. There's moments in that film that are awesome. I think it's a little long. I think it's kind of choppy in some parts, but that whole movie is completely cold. You don't even know the main protagonist's name. That is his name, is the protagonist. But right at the end, when Neil reveals that they've been friends all along, this warmth just glosses over you and you kind of get this wave of emotion and you're like, how does he do that? How does he have a cold movie and then it's just like, whoa, I feel like I care about these guys all of a sudden.
You have a future in the past. Years ago for me, years from now for you.
You've known me for years.
For me, I think this is the end of a beautiful friendship.
But for me, it's just the beginning.
We get up to some stuff. You're gonna love it. You'll see.
There's heart in The Prestige.
But you wouldn't clap yet, because making something disappear isn't enough. You have to bring it back.
There's heart in Inception, when Cillian Murphy's character and his father at the hospital bed, and he realizes that it was just the toy all along, the windmill. You know, that's incredible emotion. Dunkirk, there's little specks of emotion in there at the end when he's on the train and he's reading Churchill's speech, where Tom Hardy's standing there on the beach about to get captured. It's incredible emotion and heart.
Our thankfulness at the escape of our army must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
You also have Interstellar, where there's heart at the end when he sees his daughter after decades.
Nobody believed me, but I knew you'd come back.
How?
Because my dad promised me.
You know, it's just, that argument doesn't hold water, I think, when you put it under certain scrutiny. Now, again, the movies don't all have heart from beginning to end, but I said it spikes up in certain moments because I think he is able to pull an audience along almost this, you know, cool, heartless string, and then all of a sudden inject this, like, whoa, emotion into it. I think there was a ton of heart in Oppenheimer, especially with the dynamic, even though she doesn't have a ton of screen time, the dynamic between Oppenheimer and his wife Kitty, and how, you know, he comes closer to her at the end and how she's kind of trying to fight for him. You know, that's a beautiful little moment. His connection with Florence Pugh's character and, you know, her suicide and how that affected him. Yes, it's a bleak subject. We're talking about the creation of the weapons of mass destruction that would lead to inevitable nuclear war or nuclear conflict. But the way Nolan's able to weave some warmth and some heart in this character who's struggling with such guilt is an incredible feat. So I disagree with the notion that Nolan has no heart in his movies. I think if you watch them, they do spike into you, especially at opportune and particularly intentional moments. And that's just my opinion on that matter. But that being said, I'm not going to delve into the plot details of this movie. And once it comes out or once I watch it again, I'll get into a longer form video. I think this is probably his best movie all around. I'm going to have to sit on it a little while longer. I'm going to have to rewatch it again. But, you know, this is classic cinema. This is the reason why I used to go to the movies all the time. This is the reason why I want to go to the movies again. And I rarely go anymore unless it's for movies like this, and this is the reason why. So this is a story about a genius that was above the fray in the world, who had incredible talents, but then took on a project which gave him a lot of trauma and a lot of guilt throughout the rest of his life, as I could only imagine what this man dealt with. If you haven't seen Oppenheimer, get to the biggest screen possible and just sit back and just let this movie suck you in and experience it, feel it, and just dwell on it after the fact, because there's so much complexity here within the script, within the visual presentation, within the sound, everything. 10 out of 10, 5 stars, movie magic meter up into the oblivion. This was a fantastic film. And don't listen to the naysayers, because honestly, even if you think this movie isn't for you, there isn't a moment in this movie that you're not going to at least enjoy as an experience, especially as a theatrical experience. So go check it out.
I've got one hope.
How come?
World War II would be over. Our boys would come home.
It's happening, isn't it?
Detonator charge. 5, 4.
The atomic bomb
3
will be a terrible revelation
2
of divine power.
1.